In Clearwater, a weathered farmer was about to confront a nightmare on his own land. A quiet evening harvest turned deadly when the iron serpents roared through his fields, engines tearing up soil, and lives with equal disregard. Earl Whitmore wasn't your typical farmer. For years, he had worn the uniform of a Korean War veteran, known for surviving firestorms and standing unshaken when others faltered. When the iron serpents set fire to his barn and slashed his tires, they had no idea they were drawing the gaze of legends. Chuck Norris and Seagal stepped from the shadows, answering a call no one had spoken aloud. With calm precision, they delivered a response that would trigger a reckoning far greater than a land dispute. What began as intimidation on a farm would become a war for a community's soul. Clearwater would never be the same after two icons turned a biker gang's terror into their last mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Earl Whitmore's weathered hands moved across the corn silk with practiced tenderness. 63 harvests had taught him the language of the land, how it whispered through rustling stalks and spoke through the soil between his fingers. The setting sun painted his fields in amber and gold, casting long shadows across acres that had witnessed his joys and sorrows alike. This was the hour he cherished most, when the day's labor quieted and memories surfaced like gentle ripples in still water. "We did good this season, Margaret," he murmured to the empty air beside him. 8 years since cancer took her. But he still spoke to his wife in these twilight moments. The farm had been their shared dream, built stubborn handful by stubborn handful, through droughts and floods and everything between. Now it was his alone to tend his anchor in a world that seemed to spin faster with each passing year. The distant rumble registered first as a tremor beneath his boots, then grew into a throaty, mechanical growl that shattered the evening's tranquility. Earl straightened slowly, one hand pressing against the small of his back, as he squinted toward the gravel road that bordered his western field. They appeared first as dust devils on the horizon, then materialized into a serpentine procession of gleaming chrome and black leather. Motorcycles, at least a dozen of them, throttles wide open as they veered suddenly off the road. The lead rider, a hulking figure with a crimson bandana tied around his forehead, gunned his engine and crashed through the split-rail fence that had stood for 3 decades. "No," Earl whispered, his voice lost beneath the thunder of engines as the motorcycles tore across his freshly planted southern field, their heavy tires carving deep furrows through seedlings that had just begun to take root. Clouds of soil billowed in their wake. The bikers circled like predators, whooping and hollering as they performed wild figure-eights through his crops. Some stood on their seats, arms raised in triumph as they desecrated the results of months of careful work. Others revved their engines near the edge of his corn, the exhaust scorching tender stalks. Earl's pulse quickened as he clutched his hoe tighter and started toward them, his stride purpose-filled but unhurried. He wasn't a man who rushed toward confrontation. Even now, the lead rider spotted him and signaled to the others. One by one, they killed their engines and dismounted, forming a loose semicircle as Earl approached. In the sudden quiet, crickets cautiously resumed their evening chorus. Evening. Earl's voice remained level, though his grip on the hoe whitened his knuckles. "You boys are on private property." The leader stepped forward, tall and broad, shouldered with a meticulously maintained goatee and arms covered in faded tattoos. A ragged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-smirk. The patches on his leather vest identified him as Rex, President of the Iron Serpents. "Private property," Rex mimicked, his voice pitched higher in mockery. "You hear that, boys? Gramps is worried about his dirt." Laughter rippled through the group. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a patchy beard, spat a glob of tobacco juice onto the ground between Earl's boots. "Name's Earl Whitmore," This is my land. And I'm asking you fellas to leave. Earl kept his gaze steady, looking Rex directly in the eye despite the fact that the biker towered over him by half a head. Rex's eyes narrowed. You asking us? He leaned in close enough for Earl to smell whiskey and cigarettes on his breath. That's real polite. But see, we go where we want. Do what we want. He plucked the hoe from Earl's hands and examined it with exaggerated interest. What's this? Revolutionary War relic? More laughter, as Rex suddenly swung the hoe like a baseball bat, smashing it against a nearby fence post. The wooden handle splintered, leaving Earl holding a useless stub. Oops! Rex's smirk widened. Guess they don't make 'em like they used to. Earl's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he let the broken handle fall to the ground and straightened his shoulders. How long you had this spread, old-timer? Rex gestured broadly at the farmhouse visible in the distance, its white clapboards glowing pink in the sunset. 47 years. Earl's voice remained even. Built it with my wife. 47 years, Rex whistled, glancing back at his companions. And what's it worth now? Bet some developer would pay pretty to bulldoze this place for one of those fancy subdivisions. One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, laughed. Yeah. Call it Sunset Acres or some shit. Sell it to city folks looking to play farmer on weekends. Earl felt heat rising up his neck, but kept his expression neutral. Not for sale. Never will be. Everything's for sale, Pops, Rex countered, circling Earl slowly. Just depends on the pressure applied. He paused, eyes flicking toward the old barn where Earl's tractor and equipment were stored. Nice setup you got. Be a shame if something happened to it. The threat hung in the air, clear as the evening sky above them. I served in Korea, Earl said quietly. Seen men like you before. Loud. Thinking fear makes you strong. Rex's amusement vanished, replaced by something harder. You calling me a coward, old man? No, Earl held his ground. Just saying you're making a mistake. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Rex's face, quickly masked by a theatrical laugh. The only mistake here is thinking you matter. He turned to his gang. Boys, I think Farmer Earl needs to understand his place in the food chain. What happened next? Unfolded with military precision, two bikers moved to Earl's truck parked nearby, slashing its tires with hunting knives. Three others headed toward the irrigation system, while Rex himself stalked toward the barn, pausing to grab a gas can from one of the motorcycles. Please, Earl said, his composure finally cracking as he started after Rex. That barn stood since... A rough hand caught his shoulder, spinning him around. The wiry biker, with the patchy beard, shoved him hard, sending Earl stumbling backward into the dirt. Stay down, Grandpa, the man sneered. Watch and learn. From the roadside, a handful of vehicles had pulled over. Locals Earl recognized the Peterson boys' pickup and old Miller's station wagon. They stood at a distance, witnessing but not intervening, faces drawn with concern and shame. Inside the barn, glass shattered. Moments later, Rex emerged with Earl's ledger books, tossing them into a metal trash can. He poured gasoline over the papers, then struck a match. Nice and toasty, Rex called as flames leapt upward. Maybe we'll roast some marshmallows. Earl pushed himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his overalls. His right palm was scraped raw, but he paid it no mind as he watched decades of records turn to ash. He'd survived worse a war. Margaret's slow decline. The flood of '97 that nearly took everything. He would survive this too. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers as someone new arrived, a dusty pickup truck pulling alongside the gathered vehicles. Earl couldn't make out the driver through the setting sun's glare, but something in the observers' postures shifted. Rex seemed oblivious to the newcomers, too busy directing his men as they systematically dismantled the irrigation pipes, tossing segments into the burning trash can where they warped and blackened. "Don't have insurance, do you, Earl?" Rex called over his shoulder. "Bet a man like you believes in handling things himself. How's that working out?" Earl didn't answer. His attention had shifted to the two figures now walking slowly down the road toward his property. One in a simple chambray shirt and jeans, the other in a black button-up and dark pants. Both moved with a particular kind of grace that Earl recognized from his military days, the contained economy of men accustomed to action. Rex followed Earl's gaze, his expression souring. "We got an audience," he announced to his gang. "Locals with nothing better to do than watch the show." He raised his voice. "Tickets cost extra, folks." The bikers laughed, but the sound held a hollow edge now, uncertain. "We're done here anyway," Rex decided, kicking over the burning trash can so that flaming debris scattered across the dirt. "Just a friendly visit, Earl, letting you know how things stand." His grin turned malicious. "We'll be back. Maybe next time we'll check out that nice house of yours." The threat lingered as the bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life in a cacophony that sent crows scattering from nearby trees. They peeled away in formation, deliberately cutting through Earl's corn on their way out, their passage leaving a swath of destruction. As the noise faded, Earl became aware of his own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The pain in his palm throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Around him, his violated land seemed to hold its breath. The locals by the roadside shifted uneasily, exchanging glances but making no move to approach. Earl didn't blame them. The Iron Serpents had a reputation that extended through 3 counties: destruction, intimidation, and occasional violence that somehow never resulted in arrests. Sheriff Dawson was either afraid or paid off, no one knew which, but the result was the same. Only as twilight deepened into dusk did Earl notice that the 2 figures he'd spotted earlier had vanished. He scanned the roadside, but they were nowhere to be seen. With methodical movements that belied his racing thoughts, Earl began gathering the scattered, half-burned papers. Tomorrow he would assess the damage, catalog what was broken, and begin repairs. Tonight, he needed to secure what remained. But as stars appeared in the darkening sky, Earl couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The Iron Serpents would return. Rex's type always did. And next time, they wouldn't stop at broken tools and slashed tires. For the first time in years, Earl locked his doors before going to bed. Morning arrived with painful clarity at Mabel's diner, where sunlight streamed through freshly washed windows to illuminate every chip in the Formica countertops, every crack in the vinyl booth seats. The place had been a town fixture since 1962, outlasting 2 recessions and the mall that opened 30 miles north. On its walls hung faded photographs of Clearwater. Through the decades, storefronts changed, hairstyles evolved, but the backdrop of rolling farmland remained constant. Until recently. "They hit the Williams place last month," Hank Miller said, his coffee cooling untouched before him. The retired postal worker lowered his voice, though every patron in the diner was already engaged in the same conversation. "Spray. Painted obscenities all over their barn." Sarah Williams was in tears at church. Across from him, Betty Parsons nodded grimly, her silver curls bouncing. Sheriff came out, took some notes, said there wasn't much he could do without witnesses. She sniffed disapprovingly. "As if we don't all know exactly who it was." "Iron Serpents." Tom Peterson almost whispered the name, glancing toward the window as if the words might summon them. They weren't like this when they first showed up. "Just passing through," is what Sheriff Dawson said. "Now they're like, occupying the place." The bell above the door chimed, and conversations faltered as Earl Whitmore entered. His right hand was wrapped in gauze, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. But he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. He nodded to familiar faces as he made his way to the counter. "Morning, Earl." Mabel herself emerged from the kitchen, coffee pot in hand. "Heard about what happened? You okay?" "I've seen worse," Earl answered simply, accepting the steaming mug she offered. "Fence can be mended. Crops will recover. Most of them." A heavy silence followed his words. Everyone knew what had happened in a town of 200. News traveled fast, especially bad news. "Earl." Tom Peterson slid onto the stool beside him, voice pitched low. "We should have done something. We were there, and we just watched." Earl took a measured sip of coffee before responding. "What would you have done, Tom? Get yourself hurt? Or worse? They outnumbered us, and they were looking for trouble." "Still doesn't make it right," Tom insisted, color rising in his cheeks. "No," Earl agreed quietly. "It doesn't." The door chimed again, and this time the silence that fell was absolute. Two men entered, strangers, yet somehow familiar to everyone who watched action films or owned a television. The first man moved with contained precision, medium height, with a muscular build that his simple clothing couldn't disguise. His reddish-brown hair was neatly trimmed, his face weathered but remarkably fit for a man in his 70s. The second was taller, broader, with a ponytail of dark hair streaked with silver, and an impassive expression that seemed carved from stone. Recognition rippled through the diner in murmured whispers. "Is that? Can't be. What would they be doing here?" Mabel recovered first, professional smile sliding into place as she approached them. "Welcome to Clearwater. What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Coffee. Black," the first man answered, his voice quiet but carrying a note of unmistakable authority. "And whatever breakfast special you recommend." "Same," the second man added, his gaze already sweeping the diner with methodical assessment. They took a booth near the back, and conversations gradually resumed, though every eye in the place stole glances their way. It wasn't just their celebrity that commanded attention, it was the way they carried themselves, a centered presence that seemed to take up more space than their physical bodies. "Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal," Betty Parsons whispered, not quite quietly enough. "In Clearwater. Must be filming something." "No cameras," Hank pointed out. "No crew. Just them." Earl focused on his breakfast, but he too found his attention drawn to the newcomers. There was something in their demeanor that felt familiar, not from movies, but from his time in Korea. Men who had seen combat carried themselves differently. There was an awareness, a readiness that never quite left them. Halfway through his eggs, Earl became conscious of being watched. He glanced up to find Chuck Norris looking directly at him, a question in his eyes. Earl met his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor deferring. After a moment, Chuck nodded a small gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps respect. Earl returned the nod and went back to his meal. The exchange lasted seconds, but it didn't go unnoticed. Tom Peterson looked between them, confusion written across his face. "You know him?" Tom asked under his breath. Earl shook his head. "Never met him." "Then why?" "Some things don't need words," Earl replied, signaling Mabel for more coffee. As the morning progressed, patrons finished their meals and departed, though many lingered longer than usual, hoping to overhear something from the stranger's table. But the two men spoke little, and when they did, their voices remained too low to catch. Sheriff Dawson arrived for his usual 10 a.m. coffee, his gaze immediately fixing on the celebrities in the corner booth. The lawman's perpetually sunburned face tightened as he made his way to their table. "Gentlemen," Dawson said, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. "Don't often see famous faces in Clearwater." Chuck looked up with polite disinterest. "Just passing through. Filming something nearby?" Dawson pressed, rocking slightly on his heels. "No," Stephen answered, his expression impassive. "Taking some time off." Dawson nodded too many times. "Well, enjoy your stay. If you need anything, directions, recommendations, the sheriff's office is just down the street." "We'll keep that in mind," Chuck said, in a tone that suggested they wouldn't. Dawson lingered awkwardly for another moment before retreating to the counter, where he leaned toward Mabel. "How long they been here?" "Just came in for breakfast," she answered, already pouring his coffee. Keeping to themselves. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." "Huh." Dawson's gaze flicked back toward them. "Odd choice of vacation spot." Earl finished his meal in thoughtful silence. As he paid his bill, his attention was drawn to the window, where a familiar motorcycle, a gleaming Harley with a distinctive serpent emblem, rolled slowly past the diner. It was Rex's second-in-command, the wiry man with the patchy beard. He idled at the curb, staring directly at Earl through the glass with a cold smirk, before gunning the engine and speeding away. The message couldn't have been clearer. "We're watching you." Earl felt the diner's attention shift to him, concern from some, pity from others. He straightened his shoulders and turned toward the door, refusing to let his expression change. "Earl." Mabel's voice stopped him. "Why don't you let Tom and some of the boys help you fix that fence today?" Tom perked up. "I've got my tools in the truck. Wouldn't take more than a couple hours with a few of us." Earl hesitated. Pride warred with practicality. He'd never been one to ask for help, but the truth was, his hand was throbbing beneath the bandage, and the fence needed fixing before his cattle found the gap. "Appreciate the offer," he said finally. "Could use an extra pair of hands." Tom's face brightened. "I'll round up a couple guys. Meet you at your place in 20. As Earl stepped outside into the morning sunshine, he was surprised to find himself flanked by the two strangers, who had also finished their meal. "Your farm? The one that had trouble last night?" Chuck asked without preamble. Earl studied him for a moment. "News travels fast in small towns. Heard some talk," Stephen confirmed, his voice unexpectedly soft for a man of his size. "Bikers?" "The Iron Serpents," Earl confirmed. "Been making themselves at home in Clearwater for a few months now." He found himself adding, "Sheriff's not much help." "Rarely is," Chuck observed dryly. For a moment, the three men stood in silence. An odd tableau against the backdrop of small-town America, the farmer, weathered by years of hard work, and two aging action stars, who seemed somehow more substantial in person than on screen. "Well," Earl said finally. "Got work waiting." He moved toward his truck, then remembered its slashed tires with a grimace. "Need a ride?" Chuck offered, gesturing to a dusty pickup parked across the street. Earl considered declining, then reconsidered. "If it's no trouble." "No trouble," Stephen assured him, already moving toward the vehicle. As the three men drove out of town, they passed a group of bikers parked in front of the liquor store, engines idling. Rex stood at their center, a beer in hand, despite the early hour. His eyes narrowed as he recognized Earl in the passenger seat, then widened as he registered the driver. His lips formed words that Earl couldn't hear but could easily interpret. "What the hell?" In the truck's side mirror, Earl watched Rex pull out a phone and start dialing, his expression dark with suspicion and something that might have been the first flicker of uncertainty. The truck rumbled past the town limits, heading toward Earl's farm. Nobody spoke, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Earl found himself studying his companions covertly. Up close, they were older than they appeared on television. Lines etched deeply around their eyes. Their hands spotted with age marks, not unlike his own. Yet there was a vitality to them, a centered strength that had nothing to do with youth. "Been farming long?" Chuck asked, breaking the silence. "All my life," Earl answered. "This land was my father's before me." Stephen nodded appreciatively. "Family legacy, something worth protecting." "Yes," Earl agreed, finding unexpected resonance in the simple statement. "It is." As the truck crested the final hill, Earl's farmhouse came into view, white clapboard against green fields, the damaged fence visible from the road. 3 vehicles were already parked in the drive. Tom Peterson's pickup and 2 others belonging to men from town. Chuck pulled in behind them and cut the engine. "Looks like you've got help after all." "Appears so," Earl said, surprised and somewhat moved by the sight of his neighbors unloading tools from their trucks. Perhaps something was shifting in Clearwater after all. As he climbed out of the pickup, Tom approached, enthusiasm faltering as he recognized the driver and passenger. "Mr. Whitmore," Tom began, eyes wide. These are friends," Earl supplied simply. "Giving me a ride home." Chuck extended a hand. "Chuck Norris. This is Seagal." "I know," Tom said faintly, shaking the offered hand with visible awe. Everyone knows." "But why?" "Just passing through," Stephen said, repeating their explanation from the diner. Earl turned toward the damaged fence, effectively ending the awkward exchange. "Best get started before the day gets away from us." The men from town followed, casting backward glances at the celebrities who fell into step behind them. At the fence line, Earl assessed the damage with a practical eye. 3 sections destroyed, posts uprooted, rails splintered. "Got spare lumber in the barn," he said, already rolling up his sleeves despite his injured hand. "Should have enough to replace what's broken." To his surprise, Chuck and Stephen didn't leave. Instead, Chuck removed his overshirt, revealing muscular arms that belied his age, while Stephen rolled his shoulders, as if preparing for exertion. "Show us what needs doing," Chuck said simply. For the next few hours, they worked alongside the local men, who gradually overcame their initial starstruck awkwardness. Chuck proved remarkably handy with a hammer, driving nails with precision that suggested years of practical experience. Stephen's strength made light work of setting new posts, his movements efficient and surprisingly graceful for such heavy labor. Throughout the morning, Earl noticed vehicles slowing as they passed his property, townspeople driving by to confirm the rumors already spreading through Clearwater. Some stopped, offering assistance that wasn't strictly needed, but was welcomed nonetheless. By noon, nearly a dozen people were working on various repairs around the farm. As they broke for lunch, sandwiches provided by Betty Parsons, who just happened to be driving by. With enough food for 20, Earl found himself seated on his porch steps between the 2 unlikely visitors. "Appreciate the help," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Community coming together," Chuck observed, watching as townspeople chatted and worked. "That's how it should be." "Been a while since I've seen it," Earl admitted. "People get scared. Keep their heads down." Stephen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fear only works when people are isolated. Together." He nodded toward the growing crowd. "That changes the equation." Before Earl could respond, the distant rumble of motorcycles cut through the afternoon quiet. The sound grew steadily louder, and conversations faltered as heads turned toward the road. "They're coming back," Tom said, tension evident in his voice. Earl rose slowly to his feet, his expression resolute. Beside him, Chuck and Stephen exchanged a glance but remained seated, their postures relaxed, yet somehow more alert. The iron serpents appeared on the horizon, chrome flashing in the sunlight as they approached in tight formation. This time, they didn't veer off the road to crash through the newly repaired fence. Instead, they slowed, then stopped completely, forming a line along the roadside. Rex dismounted first, removing his helmet with theatrical slowness. His eyes swept over the gathered townspeople, narrowing when they landed on Earl. Then his gaze shifted to the two men, still seated on the porch steps, and his expression changed recognition, disbelief, and something that might have been the first hint of concern. "Well, well," Rex called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Quite the welcome committee, Earl." He gestured toward Chuck and Stephen. "Even brought in celebrities. What is this, a charity event? Save the old farmer?" Nervous laughter rippled through the gang, but it sounded forced. Earl started toward them, but Chuck's voice stopped him. "Let them come to you," he said quietly. "Your land. Your terms." Earl considered this, then nodded, remaining where he stood as Rex swaggered forward, stopping at the edge of the property. "Didn't expect to see you back on your feet so soon, old-timer," Rex called, feigning surprise. "And with so many new friends." "Neighbors," Earl corrected. "And yes, I'm still standing." Rex's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That so? Well, don't get too comfortable. We were just passing by. Thought we'd see if you'd reconsidered our conversation about selling." "Nothing to reconsider," Earl replied evenly. "This land isn't for sale." Rex's facade of affability slipped. "Everything's negotiable, Pops. You just need the right motivation." His gaze drifted meaningfully toward the barn, where fresh burn marks scarred the doorframe. Earl felt rather than saw Chuck and Stephen rise and move to stand on either side of him. Their presence was like a physical force, solid, immovable. Rex faltered almost imperceptibly before covering with a bark of laughter. "Seriously? You brought in the geriatric action squad?" He turned to his gang. "Hey boys, the old man's got bodyguards. Guess we should be scared." The bikers laughed on cue, but there was an edge to it now. Several cast uncertain glances toward the martial arts legends. "We're just having a friendly conversation," Rex continued, spreading his hands in mock innocence. "No need for Hollywood heroes." "Then there's nothing more to say," Earl stated flatly. "You're not welcome on my property." A dangerous light entered Rex's eyes. "You sure that's the position you want to take? Because we've got all day." He gestured toward his gang, their machines idling ominously. "And there's a lot more we could talk about." The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. For a long moment, no one moved. The townspeople watched with tense expressions. The bikers revved their engines in rhythmic intimidation, and the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Then Steven Seagal took one step forward. It was a small movement, almost casual, yet it carried such presence that all eyes instantly fixed on him. His expression remained impassive as he met Rex's gaze directly. "The man asked you to leave," Steven said, his voice quiet yet carrying effortlessly across the yard. Rex blinked, visibly thrown by the direct confrontation. He recovered quickly, forcing a dismissive laugh. "Or what? You'll show us some movie stunts?" Chuck moved to stand beside Stephen, his stance relaxed but purposeful. "Why don't we continue this conversation another time, when tempers aren't so high?" It was a peace offering of sorts, a path for Rex to retreat with some dignity intact. For a moment, It seemed he might take it. Uncertainty flashing across his face as he measured the two men before him, not just celebrities, he now realized, but something more dangerous. But pride won out. You know what? I'm getting real tired of interruptions. Rex squared his shoulders, addressing his gang without taking his eyes off Chuck and Steven. Boys, I think it's time we taught Farmer Earl and his famous friends some manners. The bikers revved their engines in unison, the sound thunderous in the afternoon quiet. As if choreographed, they dismounted and began moving forward as a group, some pulling out chains or brass knuckles. Earl felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but held his ground. Beside him, Chuck and Steven remained utterly still, watching the approaching gang with expressions that betrayed neither fear nor excitement, only calm, focused awareness. Last chance to walk away, Chuck said, the words carrying a weight beyond their simple meaning. Rex's answer was a humorless grin as he reached into his vest and produced a switchblade, the blade snapping open with a metallic click. No, old man, this is your last chance. And with that, he lunged forward. The blade sliced through empty air as Chuck sidestepped with fluid economy, moving just enough to avoid the attack without retreating. In the same motion, his hand closed around Rex's wrist, applying precise pressure that made the biker's fingers spasm open. The knife fell harmlessly to the dirt. Rex stared at his empty hand in disbelief before rage contorted his features. He swung wildly with his free arm, a haymaker that telegraphed its intention long before it came near its target. Chuck blocked the punch with his forearm, the impact making a sound like a baseball hitting a catcher's mitt. In one continuous movement, he shifted his weight, using Rex's forward momentum to propel him past and slightly off balance. Walk away, Chuck repeated, his voice still calm despite the violence unfolding. Rex's response was a roar as he spun back, launching another attack that met with similar results, his aggression expertly redirected, his strength turned against him without Chuck appearing to exert himself at all. The other bikers hesitated, watching their leader's ineffectual assault with growing unease. This wasn't going according to plan. The aging action star wasn't playing his role as an easy target. What are you waiting for? Rex shouted between labored breaths. Get them! Galvanized by the command, 3 bikers rushed forward, the wiry man with the patchy beard leading the charge, a length of chain swinging from his fist. He aimed for Steven, perhaps judging the larger man as slower. It proved a critical miscalculation. Steven moved with surprising grace for his size, stepping into the attack rather than away from it. His hands shot out with snake-like quickness, capturing the chain mid-swing. With a subtle twist of his wrists and shift of his stance, he used the biker's own momentum to pull him forward and off balance. The man stumbled, eyes widening in shock as Steven slipped behind him in one fluid motion. A precisely applied pressure to the shoulder, a subtle redirection of force, and the biker found himself face down in the dirt, his arm immobilized in a joint lock that required minimal effort to maintain but caused maximum discomfort. Stay down, Steven advised quietly. It gets worse from here. The 2 other attackers faltered, exchanging uncertain glances. One carried brass knuckles, the other a tire iron. Both now looked significantly less confident. Seeing their hesitation, Earl stepped forward. This doesn't need to continue, he said, addressing the group. Just leave. No one needs to get hurt. From his position on the ground, the wiry biker spat dirt and curses. Steven increased pressure on the joint lock incrementally, transforming the curses into a pained whimper. Easy, Steven murmured, easing the hold just enough to avoid causing actual damage. Breathe. Meanwhile, Rex had backed away from Chuck, chest heaving, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose, though Chuck had never appeared to strike him directly. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, eyes burning with humiliation and rage. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, addressing Earl rather than his unflappable opponent. "You think having celebrities play bodyguard makes you untouchable?" "No one's untouchable," Earl replied evenly. "But this is still my land, and you're still not welcome on it." The standoff hung suspended in the shimmering afternoon heat. The only sounds the buzz of insects and the subdued groans of the pinned biker. The remaining gang members clustered uncertainly by their motorcycles, watching for cues from their leader but making no move to join the fray. Rex's gaze darted from Chuck to Stephen, then to the gathering of townspeople who had initially retreated but now stood their ground, several clutching makeshift weapons, hammers, wrenches, fence posts. The equation had shifted dramatically since his arrival. "This isn't over," he declared, jabbing a finger toward Earl. "Not by a long shot." With as much dignity as he could muster, he backed toward his motorcycle, gesturing sharply for his men to do the same. Stephen released the wiry biker, who scrambled to his feet and retreated, throwing venomous looks over his shoulder. One by one, the iron serpents mounted their bikes. Rex, the last to do so, fixed Earl with a final glare. "Tonight," he said, voice pitched to carry. "We finish this tonight." With a roar of engines, they departed, dust billowing in their wake as they vanished down the rural road. A collective exhalation seemed to pass through the gathering as tension drained away, replaced by nervous laughter and animated conversation. Tom Peterson approached Earl, eyes wide with lingering adrenaline and newfound admiration. "That was... I've never seen anything like that," he stammered, glancing toward Chuck and Stephen, who stood calmly discussing something in low voices. "They didn't even throw a punch, they just... controlled everything." Earl nodded thoughtfully. "Different kind of strength," he observed. "Not what Rex understands." The excitement rippled through the group as people recounted what they'd witnessed, each version growing slightly more dramatic in the retelling. Earl found himself at the center of attention as neighbors patted his shoulder and offered support, something that would have embarrassed him in the past, but now felt strangely reassuring. As the crowd gradually dispersed, returning to their interrupted repair work with renewed vigor, Chuck approached Earl. "He meant what he said," Chuck observed quietly. "About coming back tonight." Earl sighed, gazing out over his fields where the day's shadows were beginning to lengthen. "I know. They'll bring more men," Stephen added, joining them. "And they won't be looking for a fair fight." "Never were," Earl replied dryly. The three men stood in silence for a moment, each weighing the gravity of the situation from their own perspective. Earl felt the familiar weight of responsibility for his land, while sensing the strangers beside him carried different but equally substantial burdens. "Why are you helping?" Earl finally asked, the question direct but not ungrateful. "You don't know me. This isn't your fight." Chuck's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, not quite a smile, but a softening. "Some things are worth standing for, regardless of who's involved." "Principle," Stephen added with a slight nod. "When men like that go unchallenged, they only grow bolder." Earl studied them both, recognizing something that went beyond their public personas, a core of genuine conviction that couldn't be faked for cameras or audiences. Whatever had brought these two men to Clearwater, it wasn't publicity or fortune. "Well," Earl said simply, "I appreciate it." As the afternoon waned, most of the townspeople departed with promises to return if needed. Tom Peterson was the last to leave, visibly reluctant. "We could stay," he offered, gesturing to himself and the two other men who had helped with the fence. "Safety in numbers." Earl shook his head. "They'll be coming after dark. No sense in putting more people at risk, but—" "Go home to your family, Tom," Earl said firmly. "I'll be fine." After Tom's departure, Earl invited Chuck and Stephen into the farmhouse. The interior was modestly furnished, but meticulously maintained hardwood floors gleamed with decades of care, and handmade quilts draped over well-worn furniture. Photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace, chronicling a lifetime. Earl in military uniform, Earl and Margaret on their wedding day, the two of them in front of the newly built farmhouse, and later shots showing the subtle changes of aging together. Stephen paused before the photographs, studying them with quiet respect. "Your wife?" "Margaret," Earl confirmed, moving to the kitchen where he filled an old copper kettle. "Been gone 8 years now. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Chuck said, the simple words carrying genuine empathy. Earl nodded acknowledgement as he set the kettle on the stove. "We had 41 good years, more than some get." While they waited for water to boil, Earl retrieved his shotgun from the cabinet and methodically checked its condition. The weapon was old but immaculately maintained, like everything else on the farm. "Haven't fired this in years," he admitted, more to himself than his guests. "Not since we had a coyote problem back in 5. "Hope you won't need to tonight," Chuck remarked, accepting the mug of coffee Earl offered. "Hope is fine," Stephen said, his gaze drifting toward the windows where twilight was gathering. "Preparation is better." They discussed strategy. As night fell, not elaborate plans, but practical considerations. Which approaches the bikers might take, vulnerable points around the property, how to minimize damage to the farm while protecting themselves. "They'll come in force," Chuck predicted, sketching a rough map of the property on a notepad. "Probably from multiple directions. Their advantage is numbers. And willingness to destroy," Earl added grimly. Stephen nodded. "But they have weaknesses. No discipline. No real unity. They follow Rex out of fear, not loyalty. And Rex follows his ego," Chuck concluded. "That's leverage we can use." As full darkness descended, they positioned themselves strategically around the property. Earl took the front porch with his shotgun, a visible statement that he wasn't hiding or running. Chuck stationed himself near the barn, where approaching vehicles would be visible from multiple angles. Stephen melted into the shadows near the equipment shed, almost invisible despite his size. The night deepened, crickets chirped. An owl called from a distant tree, and the quarter moon cast silver light across the fields. Earl sat motionless in his rocking chair, shotgun across his knees, listening intently for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of his land. At precisely 11:17 p.m., the first engine growled in the distance. They killed their headlights a quarter mile out, but the rumble of their engines carried through the night air like distant thunder. Earl remained seated on his porch, outwardly calm though his heart hammered against his ribs. In his peripheral vision, he caught the subtle shift of movement as Chuck relocated to a more advantageous position. The motorcycles approached slowly this time, no dramatic entrance, no chaotic revving. This was calculated, deliberate, far more dangerous than their earlier bravado. Earl counted at least 15 distinct engines, considerably more than the morning's confrontation. Rex had indeed brought reinforcements. The lead bike emerged from the darkness first, rolling to a stop at the edge of the gravel drive. Rex cut the engine but remained seated, his face ghostly in the moonlight as he surveyed the darkened farmhouse. "Come out! Come out! Wherever you are!" Rex called, his voice carrying easily in the night stillness. "We know you're in there, Earl. No point in hiding." Earl didn't move, didn't speak. The porch was shrouded in shadow, his presence not immediately visible to those at the edge of the property. Growing impatient, Rex dismounted and stalked forward, his boots crunching on gravel. "Playing it tough, old man. That didn't work out so well this morning." He stopped abruptly as Earl leaned forward. the movement bringing him into a patch of moonlight that silvered his weathered features. "Not hiding, Rex," Earl said evenly. "Just waiting to see what new foolishness you'd bring tonight." Rex's surprise quickly transformed into a predatory smile. "All alone, I see. Where are your Hollywood bodyguards now?" "Said my goodbyes after supper." Earl lied smoothly. "They had places to be." Rex barked a laugh, turning to his assembled gang. "Hear that, boys? The celebrities cut and run." He focused back on Earl, malice sharpening his voice. "They got their little hero moment, and then they left you to face the consequences." Several bikers chuckled, emboldened by their leader's confidence. The wiry man with the patchy beard limped forward, his shoulder still tender from Stephen's joint lock. "Going to enjoy this," he snarled. "Been a long time since someone made me look bad." Earl remained seated, shotgun still across his knees, but not yet raised. "You men need to consider what you're doing here," he said calmly. "This doesn't end well for anyone." "Oh, I disagree," Rex countered, reaching into his vest to produce a glass bottle with a rag stuffed into its neck. "I think this ends exactly how we want it to." He held up a lighter, its flame dancing in the darkness. "See, Earl, we decided your precious farm needs some redecorating, starting with that nice wooden barn." A muscle twitched in Earl's jaw, but his voice remained steady. "That would be a mistake." "No, old man. The mistake was yours, thinking you could stand against us." Rex flicked the lighter open. "Thinking this land meant anything except what we decide it means." Earl finally stood, the movement slow and deliberate. The shotgun remained pointed downward, but his grip had tightened. "Last chance to leave, Rex. After this, there's no going back." For an instant, something like doubt flickered across Rex's face, a primitive instinct warning of danger, but pride quickly smothered it. He touched the lighter to the rag, which caught immediately, casting his face in hellish orange light. "Burn it down, boys," he commanded. Arm cocked back to throw the improvised firebomb toward the barn. The bottle never left his hand. A shadowy figure materialized from behind a nearby oak tree, moving with shocking speed for someone of his age. Chuck Norris closed the distance to Rex in 3 fluid strides, his hand clamping around the biker's wrist with precise pressure that caused his fingers to spasm open involuntarily. The flaming bottle dropped straight down, shattering at Rex's feet. Fire bloomed across the gravel, causing him to stumble backward with a startled curse as flames licked at his boots. "What the?" Rex's shock transformed into rage as he recognized his attacker. "You!" Chuck didn't waste breath on words. As Rex threw a wild punch, Chuck simply wasn't there anymore. Having sidestepped with minimalist efficiency, his counterattack was equally economical. A short, precise strike to Rex's solar plexus that left the larger man gasping for breath. The tableau held for a fraction of a second, the gang frozen in collective surprise, Earl standing watchfully on the porch, Chuck positioned between Rex and the farmhouse, his posture relaxed yet radiating contained power. Then chaos erupted. "Get him!" Rex wheezed, still doubled over. 3 bikers rushed forward while others scrambled for weapons stashed on their motorcycles. The first attacker reached Chuck with a roar, swinging a heavy chain in a wide arc. Chuck pivoted slightly, the chain whistling harmlessly past his ear. In the same fluid motion, he captured the chain on its return swing, wrapping it once around his forearm and yanking sharply. The biker, unprepared for the counterforce, stumbled forward into a precisely positioned elbow strike that dropped him instantly to the gravel. The second and third attackers approached more cautiously, circling to flank Chuck from both sides. One brandished a hunting knife, the other a tire iron. They coordinated their attack with surprising discipline, lunging simultaneously from opposite directions. Chuck moved like water flowing between threats, redirecting force rather than meeting it head-on. The knife wielder found his arm trapped in a joint lock that used his own momentum against him, while the tire iron embedded itself in the dirt where Chuck had been standing a split second earlier. There was nothing flashy in Chuck's defense, no high kicks or spinning techniques that characterized his films. Instead, his movements were stripped down to pure efficiency, each action precise and purposeful. Where the bikers expended energy in wild swings and shouted threats, Chuck remained centered and economical, his breathing steady, as if engaged in nothing more strenuous than a casual stroll. From the porch, Earl watched with a veteran's appreciation for tactical mastery. Chuck wasn't fighting so much as solving a physics problem, calculating angles, redirecting momentum, finding the path of least resistance that yielded maximum results. It was a study in controlled power. But the advantage of numbers was beginning to tell. As more bikers joined the fray, Chuck found himself surrounded, forced to constantly reposition, to avoid being overwhelmed. He handled each individual threat with composed precision, but there were simply too many attackers to neutralize simultaneously. Seeing an opening, Rex charged forward with a switchblade, aiming for Chuck's exposed back. Earl raised his shotgun and fired a single shot into the air. The report cracked across the night like thunder, freezing the scene momentarily. "Next one isn't a warning," Earl stated flatly, the barrel now leveled at Rex's chest. Rex halted, knife still extended, eyes darting between Earl and Chuck. A calculating look crossed his face as he assessed the situation. The old farmer wouldn't have time to stop all of them if they rushed the porch together. As if reading his thoughts, Earl chambered another round, the metallic sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Maybe I can't get all of you," he acknowledged. "But I'll definitely get you, Rex." A tense standoff ensued, broken by an unexpected sound from the direction of the equipment, shed a pained yelp, followed by a heavy thud. All eyes turned to see two bikers sprawled on the ground, with Seagal standing calmly between them, hands relaxed at his sides. Unlike Chuck's contained, precise style, Steven moved with flowing, almost theatrical grace, less a soldier than a force of nature. "Evening," Steven said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Rex's face contorted with fury and disbelief. "More tricks? How many washed-up actors you got hiding around here, old man?" "Just us," Chuck answered for Earl, using the distraction to create distance between himself and the surrounding bikers. "More than enough, I'd say." The gang's initial confidence had evaporated, replaced by uncertain glances and nervous shifting. They'd expected to intimidate a lone old farmer, not contend with two men whose lifetime of martial arts training made them formidable despite their age. "This is still 15 against 3, Rex snarled, attempting to rally his men. "And one of those 3 is pushing 70. He gestured contemptuously toward Earl. 72. "Actually," Earl corrected mildly, shotgun unwavering. "Old enough to know better than to start a fight. Young enough to finish one if needed." Steven moved forward with the smooth, unhurried gait of a man entirely comfortable with violence but not eager to employ it. "Walk away," he suggested to the assembled bikers. "This doesn't have to get worse." Something in his tone, the quiet certainty, perhaps, or the complete absence of bravado, caused several of the gang members to exchange glances. One even took a step backward toward his motorcycle. Rex noticed the wavering resolve and reacted with characteristic fury. "Stand your ground, you cowards! They're bluffing!" To demonstrate his point, he lunged toward Steven with his switchblade extended. What followed happened almost too quickly to follow. Steven's hands moved in a fluid sequence that seemed to barely touch Rex, yet somehow redirected his charge, sent the knife spinning harmlessly into the darkness, and left the gang leader face down in the dirt, with his arm twisted behind him at an unnatural angle. Pressure points and joint manipulation. Stephen explained conversationally, maintaining the hold with minimal visible effort. The human body has so many vulnerabilities if you know where to look. To emphasize his point, he applied subtle pressure that made Rex gasp in pain. The standoff might have erupted into full-scale violence if not for the distant wail of a siren, growing steadily louder. Rex's head snapped toward the sound, his expression darkening further. Sheriff Dawson, finally deciding to do his job. Bit convenient on timing. Wasn't us? Earl said truthfully. We've learned not to rely on the law around here. The approaching siren cast new uncertainty into the equation. Whatever influence Rex might have over the local sheriff, witnesses and formal complaints would create complications. This isn't over, Rex spat, backing toward his motorcycle. Not even close. It could be, Chuck countered, his voice level. Walk away, Rex. Find someplace else to throw your weight around. You don't get to decide that, old man. Rex snarled, though he continued retreating. This is our town now. The wiry biker with the patchy beard glanced nervously at the road. Rex, we should go. The sheriff. Shut up! Rex's composure was cracking, his carefully cultivated aura of control slipping. All of you, get on your bikes. Now! The gang scrambled to comply, engines roaring to life in ragged sequence. Rex was the last to mount, his eyes burning with hatred as he pointed at Earl. I'm not done with you, he promised. Not by a long shot. Earl met his gaze steadily, neither flinching nor responding to the threat. With a final rev of engines, the iron serpents departed, gravel spraying from beneath their tires as they vanished into the darkness, not toward town and the approaching siren, but in the opposite direction, toward the county line. Dawn painted the horizon in watercolor strokes of pink and gold as Earl stepped onto his porch, shotgun in hand. Chuck and Stephen flanked him, their expressions calm despite the approaching threat. This time, the rumble of motorcycles was accompanied by the deeper growl of larger engines, trucks, and SUVs joining the Iron Serpent's procession. Brought reinforcements, Earl observed grimly. The motorcade rolled to a stop at the edge of Earl's property. Rex dismounted first, his movements conveying theatrical confidence. Behind him, bikers formed a loose semicircle, many brandishing weapons that gleamed dully in the early light. From one of the trucks emerged a tall man in an expensive suit that seemed incongruously formal against the rural backdrop. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his leather shoes dust-free despite the environment. Marcus Harrington, Earl supplied, recognition darkening his features. CEO of Vista Development. Harrington approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference. Mr. Whitmore, he called, his voice carrying the polished cadence of boardrooms. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your property. Earl stepped off the porch to meet Harrington at the boundary. Nothing to discuss. My land isn't for sale. Harrington's smile didn't waver. Everything has a price, Mr. Whitmore. He withdrew a folded document from his jacket. I've prepared an offer. The terms are quite favorable. Earl didn't even glance at the paper. Not interested. A flicker of annoyance crossed Harrington's features. You haven't even looked at the numbers. Don't need to. This land isn't about numbers. Harrington's facade of geniality thinned. Progress is inevitable. The highway extension is coming whether you sell or not. The only question is whether you benefit from it. My answer remains the same. Harrington's gaze shifted to Chuck and Stephen with new calculation. Your house guests have complicated matters unnecessarily. Local issues should be resolved locally. By locally, you mean through intimidation and vandalism? Chuck inquired mildly. I have no idea what you're implying. Vista Development operates entirely within the law, while employing those who don't, Stephen observed, nodding toward Rex and his gang. Independent contractors. Harrington dismissed with a wave. Their methods are their own concern. Earl studied the developer with growing clarity. How many others have you forced out? The Petersons? The Williams family? All those accidents and vandalism that was you pulling strings through Rex. I'm a businessman, Harrington replied coldly. Sometimes pressure is necessary to ensure people recognize their own best interests. That's not business, Earl countered. That's extortion. Harrington gestured toward his assembled force. I had hoped to resolve this amicably, but I'm prepared for alternatives. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward from one of the vehicles, his expression carefully neutral. Having a problem here, gentlemen? No problem, Harrington replied smoothly. Just a negotiation that's hit a temporary impasse. Negotiation backed by threat, Chuck pointed out. Dawson deliberately avoided meeting Chuck's gaze. Mr. Harrington is a prominent investor in our community. His development plans will bring jobs and tax revenue that Clearwater desperately needs. So that's the arrangement, Earl said. Pieces falling into place. The sheriff turns a blind eye while you and your thugs terrorize people off their land. The tension ratcheted higher, the confrontation balancing on a knife's edge. But just as the situation seemed poised to explode, a new sound joined the standoff, the rumble of approaching engines from the opposite direction. Tom Peterson led a convoy of vehicles in his pickup, pulling to a stop at the edge of the property. Behind him, vehicle after vehicle arrived, until at least 50 townspeople had assembled, their expressions grim and determined. What is this? Harrington demanded. Clearwater, Earl answered simply. Tom approached with several neighbors. Heard, there might be trouble. Word spread fast after last night. Harrington recovered quickly. There's no trouble here, folks. Just a business discussion that doesn't concern... It concerns all of us, interrupted Betty Parsons, stepping forward with surprising authority. When you threaten one of us, you threaten Clearwater itself. Sheriff Dawson moved to intercept the growing crowd. This is private property. I'm going to have to ask all of you to disperse. Funny, Hank Miller called. You weren't concerned about trespassing when the Iron Serpents were vandalizing farms all over the county. The atmosphere had shifted palpably, the intimidating force suddenly outnumbered by ordinary citizens whose fear had given way to collective action. Rex stepped forward. Frustration evident. We gonna let these hicks talk to us like this? He demanded of Harrington. My boys are ready to send a message they won't forget. Harrington hesitated, weighing options that had suddenly become far less favorable. Violence against a single farmer was one thing. A confrontation with half the town was another matter entirely. Your call, Mr. Harrington, Chuck said quietly. But whatever happens next gets witnessed by a lot more people than you planned for. This is merely a postponement, Harrington declared, folding the contract and returning it to his pocket. Market forces are inevitable, Mr. Whitmore. He turned to leave, but Rex blocked his path, face flushed with rage. That's it? We just walk away after they made fools of us? Stand down, Rex, Harrington ordered. Screw that, Rex snarled. You promised me a cut of this deal. Said I could handle the old man my way once we got what we needed. Harrington's expression flickered with barely contained fury at this public exposure of their arrangement. We'll discuss this later. No, Rex insisted. We settle this now. He turned toward Earl, Chuck, and Stephen, pointing accusingly. These three humiliated me. Nobody does that. The biker charged forward, pulling a hunting knife from his boot as he crossed the property line. Chuck smoothly interposed himself, sidestepping the wild attack with practiced ease. "Don't do this," Chuck advised calmly. Rex circled warily, knife extended. "You're just a washed-up movie star. Let's see how tough you really are." Chuck remained centered, his posture neither aggressive nor retreating. "Violence isn't the answer here, Rex. Easy for you to say," Rex spat. "You've got everything: fame, money, respect. Men like me have to take what we want." "And how's that working out?" Chuck asked quietly. The simple question enraged Rex. He lunged forward, knife slashing in a deadly arc. Chuck evaded with minimal movement, allowing the blade to pass harmlessly through empty air. As Rex overextended, Chuck delivered a precise strike to his wrist that caused the knife to drop from suddenly nerveless fingers. Rex stumbled backward, shocked, then charged again with a roar of frustration. This time he threw wild punches, each telegraphed by his rage, each countered or redirected by Chuck's efficient defense. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker: Rex all fury and wasted motion, Chuck all economy and centered power. "Stand and fight," Rex demanded between labored breaths, increasingly desperate. "I am standing," Chuck replied calmly. "You're the one who keeps falling." As if to prove the point, Rex launched another unbalanced assault that Chuck sidestepped, adding the slightest pressure to redirect the biker's momentum. Rex sprawled ungracefully in the dirt. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, bikers and townspeople alike. The town had watched Rex intimidate and terrorize for months. Now they witnessed him reduced to clumsy ineffectiveness by an opponent who barely seemed to exert himself. Rex pushed himself up, face contorted with humiliation. "This is all a setup," he snarled, turning to his gang. "All of you get them." The Iron Serpents hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The odds had shifted dramatically, and Rex's faltering performance had cracked the foundation of fear upon which their power rested. Taking advantage of the hesitation, Stephen stepped forward with fluid grace that belied his size. No wasted motion, no theatrical flourishes, just precise, economical movements that seemed almost gentle until one observed their devastating effects. The contrast could not have been more stark. Chaos versus control. Brute force versus refined technique. Arrogance versus mastery. And everyone watching could see the inevitable conclusion unfold like a physical demonstration of natural law. Rex launched one final desperate attack against Chuck. This time, he feinted left before throwing all his weight into a haymaker aimed at Chuck's head. Chuck didn't retreat or dodge. Instead, he stepped slightly forward, inside the arc of the punch, and met Rex with a single precise strike to the solar plexus, delivered with such controlled power that it stopped the larger man in his tracks. Rex froze, eyes wide with shock as the air evacuated his lungs. He sank slowly to his knees, arms wrapped around his midsection. The fight ended not with dramatic knockouts or broken bones, but with the simple, inescapable demonstration of skill over force, discipline over rage. One by one, the remaining Iron Serpents backed away, unwilling to share their leader's humiliation. In the sudden quiet, Earl stepped forward to stand beside Chuck and Stephen. "I believe we're done here," he said, addressing Harrington rather than the incapacitated Rex. The threat of violence that had been Harrington's leverage was now rendered impotent, while witnesses observed his connection to criminal intimidation. The tables had turned completely, and in the clear light of dawn, respect had found its rightful place, not with those who demanded it through fear, but with those who earned it through principled stand. Autumn painted Clearwater in rich golds and reds as Earl Whitmore methodically harvested the last row of corn. His tractor, repaired and running better than it had in years, rumbled steadily across the field. Its familiar vibration, a counterpoint to his wandering thoughts. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that locals now simply called the standoff. 3 months of gradual, sometimes difficult change for both Earl's farm and Clearwater itself. The Iron Serpents had disbanded almost overnight, their intimidating presence evaporating once Rex's protection from Sheriff Dawson collapsed. Rex himself had indeed cooperated with authorities, providing documented evidence of Vista Development's systematic campaign of intimidation and corruption. Marcus Harrington now faced multiple federal charges, his company's stock plummeting as investigations expanded to similar projects in other rural communities. Sheriff Dawson had resigned rather than face recall, departing Clearwater with little fanfare and fewer defenders. His replacement, a no-nonsense deputy from the next county over, had methodically rebuilt the department's credibility through transparency and consistent enforcement. As for the farm, it thrived under renewed attention. The crops damaged during the Iron Serpent's initial invasion had largely recovered, yielding better than expected despite the rough start. Earl attributed this partly to nature's resilience, and partly to the many hands that had helped tend the fields throughout the summer. Neighbors who discovered or rediscovered the value of community. Earl guided the tractor around the final bend, bringing it to a stop near the barn where Chuck and Stephen waited. Neither man had intended to stay in Clearwater long-term, yet somehow days had stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. They'd found unexpected peace in the rhythm of rural life, while Earl had found equally unexpected friendship in two men whose public personas barely hinted at their genuine depth. "Last row?" Chuck asked as Earl descended from the tractor. "Last row," Earl confirmed, removing his work gloves. "Best yield since 8. Stephen nodded appreciatively, leaning against the barn door. Land responds to right treatment, like most things worth having. The observation hung in the air, resonant with meanings that extended far beyond agriculture. Earl had noticed this about both men during their extended stay, an ability to distill complex truths into simple statements, unadorned but profound. "Town meeting tonight," Earl reminded them, leading the way toward the farmhouse. "They're voting on the highway proposal. Which way you think it'll go?" Chuck asked, falling into step beside him. Earl considered the question carefully. "Hard to say. There's good arguments on both sides now that the intimidation's gone. The highway extension that Vista Development had so ruthlessly pursued remained a possibility, though now it would proceed if at all through proper channels, with community input and fair compensation for any affected landowners. Some in Clearwater still favored the development for its economic potential, while others preferred to maintain the town's rural character. Either way, it'll be the town's choice, Stephen observed, not decided by outside interests or corruption. That's the victory, Earl agreed. Win or lose on the specific issue. They reached the farmhouse, where the aroma of fresh coffee greeted them. Over the past months, the three men had fallen into comfortable routines. Chuck often rose first to start breakfast. Stephen tended to evening meals with surprising culinary skill, and Earl maintained his lifelong role as keeper of the land's rhythms and needs. As they settled around the kitchen table, Earl noticed Chuck checking his watch with the first hint of restlessness he'd shown in weeks. "Getting that look again?" Earl observed mildly. Chuck smiled, caught in the act. "Got a call yesterday. Film project that's been on hold is moving forward again." "Hollywood calling you home," Earl said, neither questioning nor judging. "Something like that," Chuck acknowledged. Though home has become a more complicated concept lately. Stephen nodded in understanding. "Been thinking similar thoughts. Got commitments I've put off too long." Earl absorbed this information without surprise. He'd known their stay was temporary, a unique convergence of circumstances and choices that couldn't last indefinitely. They had lives beyond Clearwater, responsibilities and identities established long before they'd happened upon his farm. "When?" he asked simply. "End of the week." "Probably," Chuck replied. "After the town meeting. Want to see how that plays out?" Earl nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude for their extended presence, understanding of their need to depart, and yes, a measure of sadness at the approaching farewell. "Farm will still be here," he said after a moment. "Doors always open." The simple invitation contained no pressure, no expectation, just the genuine offer of continuing connection. Both men acknowledged it with equal simplicity, understanding the depth beneath the plain words. As evening approached, they drove together into town for the meeting at Clearwater's modest community center. The parking lot was filled to capacity, indicating the strong interest in the night's proceedings. Inside, the atmosphere hummed with anticipation and civil debate, a dramatic contrast to the fear and silence that had pervaded such gatherings months earlier. Earl, Chuck, and Stephen found seats near the back, preferring to observe rather than participate directly. Throughout the discussion, Earl noted the transformation in his neighbors. People who had once been too intimidated to speak now voiced their opinions confidently. Tom Peterson, once hesitant in the face of Rex's intimidation, had emerged as a thoughtful advocate for balanced development. Betty Parsons argued passionately for preserving Clearwater's agricultural heritage while acknowledging the need for economic growth. When the vote finally came, the result surprised many. A modified version of the highway plan would proceed, but with significant changes to protect key agricultural lands and ensure benefits flowed directly to the community. Earl's farm and several others would remain untouched, while development would be concentrated in areas already transitioning away from agriculture. "Compromise," Chuck observed as they left the meeting. "Rare thing these days. Requires respect on all sides," Stephen added. "People willing to actually listen." Earl nodded, watching his neighbors disperse into the autumn evening, conversations continuing beyond the formal conclusion of business. "Respect has to be earned," he noted. "But once it is, it changes everything." The next few days passed with unusual swiftness as Chuck and Stephen prepared for departure. Earl found himself watching their interactions with his farm more closely, the way Chuck paused to appreciate sunrises from the porch steps, how Stephen often stood motionless in the fields at dusk, seemingly absorbing the land's essence. Their final evening arrived, cool and clear, stars emerging in a velvet sky as they shared a simple meal on the porch. Conversation flowed naturally, touching on memories of their time together and possibilities that lay ahead. No melancholy, no forced cheerfulness, just the comfortable exchange of men who had passed through extraordinary circumstances together and emerged with genuine connection. "Never expected any of this," Earl admitted as night deepened around them. "Biker gang, corrupt developers, martial arts legends showing up on my doorstep." He shook his head with a wry smile. Margaret would have called it far-fetched even for one of her mystery novels. "Sometimes reality outpaces fiction," Chuck observed. "Usually when you're not looking for adventure. Usually when you're just standing for something that matters," Stephen added. Earl considered this, finding truth in the observation. Wasn't trying to be heroic, just couldn't let them take what wasn't theirs to take. "That's usually how it starts," Chuck agreed. "Simple principles, not grand gestures." Morning arrived with golden light streaming through autumn mist. Earl found Chuck and Stephen already up, bags packed and loaded in the dusty pickup that had brought them months earlier. No drawn-out farewells, not their style, nor Earl's. "Left something for you in the barn," Chuck mentioned as they prepared to depart. "Nothing fancy, just thought it might be useful." "Thank you," Earl said, the words inadequate, yet entirely sufficient. Both of you. Farm's looking good, Stephen remarked, his gaze taking in the neatly harvested fields and repaired structures. Strong season coming next year. Planning on it, Earl affirmed. With that, they departed. No dramatic speeches, no emotional displays. Just three men who understood that some bonds required no elaborate expression. Earl watched the pickup disappear down the long drive, dust settling in its wake. Only then did he turn toward the barn, curious about Chuck's mentioned gift. Inside, he found a handcrafted wooden sign leaning against the workbench, the letters burned deep into seasoned oak. Whitmore Farm, Est. 1976, what we defend defines us. Earl ran weathered fingers over the inscription, recognizing the truth it contained. His defense of the land had never been about stubbornness or mere sentiment, but about honoring something essential, the dignity of a life built through honest labor. The integrity of promises kept. The responsibility of stewardship. He carried the sign outside and mounted it carefully beside the entrance to his drive. As he stepped back to assess his handiwork, Earl noticed vehicles approaching Tom Peterson's truck, followed by several others. The impromptu convoy pulled up beside him. Neighbors emerging with tools and supplies. "Thought you might want some help with the north field today?" Tom explained. "Getting it ready for spring planting." Earl surveyed the gathering familiar faces that had witnessed the standoff, and now continued to stand together in quieter but equally important ways. The town had changed, or perhaps simply remembered what it had always been beneath the fear and isolation. "Could use the help?" Earl acknowledged, nodding toward his newly mounted sign. "Got a lot to defend here." Tom studied the inscription, understanding flowering in his expression. "That we do," he agreed. "All of us." As they moved toward the north field together, Earl glanced back toward the empty road where Chuck and Stephen had departed. They were gone but not absent, their influence remaining in the town's renewed confidence and in Earl's own strengthened resolve. The land stretched before him, awaiting next season's planting, a canvas of possibility rather than a battlefield. He had defended it not through force but through principled stand. Not alone but alongside others who recognized something worth protecting. Earl looked up from his labor, feeling Margaret's presence beside him as surely as the warmth of the sun. "We did good," he murmured, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. And in that moment, as neighbors worked alongside him and distant fields stretched toward the horizon, Earl Whitmore knew with absolute certainty that some things, dignity, integrity, community, were indeed worth defending. Not with arrogant force, but with the steady, unyielding strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what matters most. The kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to command respect. The kind that lasts. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.